I'm Laura Humer, and I'm a host of Books in Action's new series devoted to book clubs. Tonight we have 3 members of a Maplewood South Orange book club called Melissa's Book Club: Elaine Katz, Trish DeLuca, and Meredith Silverman. So we're going to begin the show by talking a little bit about your book club. First of all, how long have you been meeting?
For about 7 years.
About 7 years. And I know that there's a story about the name of the book club. Do you know the story, Meredith?
Melissa was a founding member of the book club. She also worked at the bookstore in town. And when she moved, she was very active and very interested in books, read all the time. And when she left town, when she moved out of town, we just named our book club after her.
Oh, that's so nice. Now, has she come back and visited at all, or?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And do you all know her?
No.
No. Some of the newer members?
Right. The old-time members, because she's been gone from town for 5 or 6 years now, so some members have come in since then as new members, and they never knew her.
I understand. Okay. And about how often do you meet, Elaine?
We meet once a month.
Once a month? And is that, pretty much like clockwork? And
pretty much like clockwork.
Okay. All right. And how do you guys choose books?
It's, well, since I'm an employee at the local bookstore, sometimes it falls on me just to bring a grouping of books with me that maybe I've seen that other book clubs are reading, or something I might have heard something about. And sometimes we will email each other in advance and say, I've heard about this, let's talk about it, possibility of reading it at the next club meeting. So it's nothing formal. People bring in ideas and then we discuss them and say, okay, let's go with this one.
Or sometimes we duke it out.
Yes. You get out?
We duke it out.
Oh, you duke it out. Oh, yes. Okay, well,
sometimes we can even go on the internet and look at, we've heard about a book, and right there we go on the internet and look at a review of them. But oftentimes people bring in 3 or 4 books, and then we'll put it, sometimes when we're very organized, we'll put it on a list, and then we'll remember it for the next time. Or we pick 2 in 1 month, and that'll be for the following month.
Or when we can't make a decision, we've had half the book club read one book and the other half read another book.
Well, I think that's very unusual. Has that worked successfully for you?
I think we only did it once.
And it was fine. It was fine.
Interesting.
Actually, one time we did it with a series of Diane Mott Davidson mysteries, which I think is before Elaine's time, but we each read one of hers and then talked about, because she has a similar theme, it's the same character, it's a series of mysteries, and so we each read a different one and then came together and talked about it.
Oh, that's interesting. So it was really similar. But you're able to come to a consensus within your club without taking a formal vote on the book? Because I think most book clubs probably do take a vote.
I don't think we've ever taken a vote.
No,
We've never taken a vote.
We have some very laid-back members, so it's like, whatever.
And actually, when you said we duke it out, I think the way we've settled the duking it out is, well, let's just say we'll read this one this month and that one the next month. And so we pick both of them and we order them both at the same time and just plan it out a couple months ahead.
That sounds very civil.
We like each other.
So what's the usual format of a meeting? How does it run?
Well, I think usually the host, wherever the book club is, and we rotate homes, usually takes the lead, and sometimes they'll look on the internet for reader's guide. Sometimes the back of the books have reader's guide, and usually we just sit around informally and chit-chat for a little bit, and then usually we get around to the book, and then after that we go back to chit-chat.
Okay, all right. And refreshments are part of your meetings? Yes?
Always. Refreshments are part of the meetings. We sometimes, when we're really ambitious, go with a theme from the book, and maybe if we like this, we didn't this time, but in the past this has an Indian theme, the book that we read. And so we've met at an Indian restaurant, or we've
gotten Indian
food, sampling of something, theme type. If maybe there was a dish that was in the book and somebody tries to make something similar to it, just as in keeping with the theme.
Oh, that's nice. And what's your policy toward people who don't finish the book?
No problem.
No problem.
No problem.
Come anyway, it's a night out.
Okay, very informal. And how about, do you tend to read any particular genre of book more than others?
We mix it up. We try to, sometimes where it's very topical, kite runners or Indian theme that we did this time. this next book we picked a biography. All of a sudden somebody will say, what about a biography? So we do a biography. Sometimes classical. We read Pride and Prejudice and then went and saw the play, which was not very good, but we did go and do it.
It's good to be able to read it and then see a performance, and then it gives us a whole other thing to talk about.
Right, absolutely.
Because we met after we did both. We read the book and we saw the performance, and then we met. So we had actually the two things to talk about. And we also did that with Of Mice and Men
which was great.
Shakespeare Theater, where we planned it out. We knew that a couple members had subscriptions to the Shakespeare Theater, so we picked a play and
field trips.
Yes,
Excellent.
planned out a date and had a field trip.
That's a great idea. And so, is there any piece of advice that you would give to people starting book clubs from your experience in your book club? Any particular problem that you've had to overcome, or has everything gone smoothly?
I think the best thing is if you have a group where there isn't a person who's very domineering, who tries to get their opinion as far as what to read, how to run the meetings. I think our group has been very equanimical as far as everybody feels free to share an opinion, and there doesn't seem to be any resistance if somebody is against something, and I think that's made it very equal.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you.
Which also makes it very interesting, because all of a sudden you'll go to a book and you may have a totally different view of what the book was about, and then somebody says, but the writing was so beautiful. And you go, you're right.
Right.
That was a redeeming it was always a redeeming factor about most books.
Yes, yes. Well, actually, that brings up something else I wanted to ask, which is, does your group consist of people mostly with the same background, the same perspectives, and what, if anything, do you all have in common?
I'd say mostly what we have in common is kids the same age. And when we first started, it was, we knew each other through elementary schools, and then as our kids grew older and as some members left and we were looking for new people to join us, we sort of put a feeler out to people who had children the same age, mainly because if they came and we got off talking about the book and we got on to talking about other things, they would just be bored to tears listening to us talk about our kids.
Sure, absolutely. Very thoughtful of you. All right, so you guys just met last night, right, to discuss your latest book, which is The Inheritance of Loss by Kieran Desai. Here it is. So I'm just going to read a little bit here about the author and a short synopsis of the book without giving too much away to the audience. Last October, Kieran won the Man Booker Prize for her book. She was actually, at the age of 35, she was the youngest woman ever to win the prize, and the prize does award her £50,000, and it is a very prestigious British prize if you're not familiar with it. It was established in 1969 to reward merit, raise the stature of the author, and in the eyes of the public, and to encourage an interest in contemporary quality fiction. Kieran actually has a strong family tie with the prize, as her mother has been shortlisted 3 times since 1980, but never has won the prize yet. Kieran was born in India in 1971, and she was educated in India, England, and the U.S. And in the U.S., she studied creative writing at Columbia University. And she's also the author of a 1998 novel that was universally praised called Hullabaloo in the Guava Orchard. All right, so Inheritance of Loss, in a nutshell, is the story of an old antisocial judge living in the northeastern Himalayas in an isolated and crumbling home who wants nothing more than to retire in peace. And by the way, correct me if you disagree with this synopsis. His peace, however, is disrupted somewhat by the arrival of his orphaned granddaughter, Sai, who shows up at his doorstep. The judge's cook becomes the primary caretaker for Sai, and the cook's son, Bijou, after tremendous effort, manages to reach America. And while the cook is imagining his son's wonderful life in America, Bijou is actually experiencing unending hardship as an immigrant in New York. And in the second half of the book, a Nepalese insurgency threatens a blossoming romance between Sai and her handsome tutor, and they're forced to examine the contrast between their lives and their political interests. And the judge is meanwhile forced to examine his past and understand perhaps how he became so bitter and loveless. So that's just a short synopsis. So the first question I think most book clubs start with is, did you like it? And why don't we start with you, Elaine?
Well, actually, I hated the book. I thought it was interesting when it started, and then it got very political, and I thought the language was very flowery, and I just got lost in reading it. I thought there were a lot of words, foreign words that weren't explained very well, times weren't explained very well. I wasn't interested in the characters, and I've read books from India before, which have really, and that part of the world which have really drawn me in, but for some reason I just did not like this woman's writing.
And it sounds like especially in the second half, is that fair to say, or
well,
just
actually
throughout?
I dropped the book in the beginning. I started reading it, I got very frustrated with it, I put it down for about a month and picked it up again, and actually the second time I liked it a little better, but personally I wouldn't recommend it for somebody else.
I understand. But now, were you glad that you finished it, and did you finish it because you had a book club meeting to go to?
I finished it because I had a book club meeting to go to, and I just decided I would thumb through it and see how it ended.
Sure. And how about you, Trish? Did you like it?
I had mixed feelings about it. I enjoyed the writing. I thought the writing was really beautiful. I think that she won this prize for a reason. Some of her descriptions were just really, really powerful. I felt like, and Meredith and I had actually spoken about this before meeting because we ran into each other in town and said, well, didn't we read this book before? That the characterizations are really detailed in how they're drawn out, but a lot of them are similar to other Indian-themed books that we've read.
Well, that's an interesting point. And we'll actually move on to that next, but first, Meredith, how about you? Would you say that you
I
liked
couldn't
it?
say that I liked it or disliked it. I wasn't crazy about it because it does seem like a similar theme that we'd read before. And I think I just never understood the point of why she wrote it. Now this is, what is it about a history? Is it a political history thing about happened in the 80s, or are you trying to show what it's like in India compared to America, because it flashes back and forth? And I just didn't really understand. They're very sad characters, and terrible things happen to them. And so, what does she really want to tell us about this?
So you didn't feel that she really pulled together the different pictures that she was showing of different places?
No, I really didn't.
The plight of different
although there was an awful lot of interest about that. I mean, every time I read one of these books about certain areas like India or Afghanistan or Iraq, you learn about these cultures, but you wonder, is that what they want to tell us? And I never got like you said, the full picture of it.
Right, I understand. All right, well, we're almost ready for our break, but first, can you comment, any of you, on the general take of the group? Was there a general consensus that they weren't crazy about it, or actually you three all had pretty different opinions?
I'd say the general consensus was, I think Meredith and I were the most favorable.
Yes, we were the ones that liked it the most, so there you have
Glad
it.
we have you here tonight.
And several people didn't finish it because they just didn't like it.
Interesting.
And some people threw it.
I hope not.
And when we were describing, actually, when I was describing how beautiful the language was, a couple of people said, really? They just didn't see it.
Interesting. All right, well,
way.
we're going to move to a short break, and we'll go on to discuss the book more.
Check it out, man.
What is that?
It looks like someone's belly. Yeah, probably lost it walking on the beach.
Man, just leave it. Let's go.
Welcome back. We're discussing The Inheritance of Loss with the book club, Melissa's Book Club. My guests tonight are Elaine Katz and Trish DeLuca and Meredith Silverman. And the next thing I'd like you guys to discuss, perhaps, is the extreme contrasts that are presented in the book. There are a number of them. For example, the lifestyle of the judge, which is relatively luxurious compared to his cook, which is fairly sparse, and the cook's son's life in America compared to other people in America, of course. Let's see, what else? The curiosity and youth of Cy, the granddaughter, versus the stoicism of the judge, perhaps. Did these contrasts ring true to you, or do you think that they were over the top? What's your opinion?
Well, one of the things that, when you're talking about the judge being from, and his character was supposed to be drawn from a wealthier, not upbringing, but a wealthier lifestyle. But the description of the home that he lived in was really that it was wealth on the downslide. There was, and this is where her writing was very rich. You felt like you were sitting in a sponge when they were talking about describing this home in the middle of the rainy season, how the walls just absorb all of the water and turn into spider webs and scorpions and mold growing everywhere. And so to describe him as someone who was of the wealthier class in India doesn't really paint a picture that life is that great there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. How about you, Elaine? Were the contrasts too extreme for you? Was that part of your problem with the book, or was that just a different issue?
I think it was more the writing in the book that I had a problem with. But the extremes, you brought up when Bijou went to the United States, and I think there was some criticism in the book that the issues portrayed of Americans were more caricaturic. And I think that if you looked at the book, I mean, the portrayals of when Bijou really becomes a slave when he is in the United States. I mean, he's working for other immigrants and living under horrible conditions, working under horrible conditions, not even earning minimum wage. And I think it really doesn't portray Americans as badly as some of the customers, as more how horrible the immigrants population is to other immigrants. That the later immigrants to the United States are taken in by the immigrants who are a little more savvy, if you want to talk about it that way, to life in the United States, and they just entrap these new individuals and put them in a lifestyle that they can't escape from.
Mm-hmm. And do you feel like her telling of that situation was realistic? I mean, was it believable to you?
I think it's believable if you look at what goes on with New York and the Chinese populations, and there's other Russian populations where there's been exposés of people who have been enslaved or charge exorbitant fees to come to the United States and then work in restaurants and other menial jobs just to pay off the fees to come to the United States, which really never end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like being an indentured servant. He's just, in order to live, he's working nonstop.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, Bijou was, it was like he was a very naive character too, coming, it was supposed to be the dream to come here and find a better life, but he had no idea what he was getting in for. And then he seemed to be drawn to his own culture, which was sucking him further and further into poverty, as opposed to trying to, other people that he came across were making a life for themselves and reaching out and trying to figure out ways to work the system. And he just kept getting drawn further and further into his own culture within New York, and just poverty and becoming like an indentured servant.
And do you think that happens today? I mean, do you think that's...
I think it might be worse after 9/11. I think it's worse in some ways because you can't get the green cards. You can't get the immigrants that come over. So I do think it's probably very true.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting about contrasts, both the judge and the tutor were people who were educated the most in their family and pushed. The judge went to England. He became a judge. He just passed these tests in order to become a judge. And the tutor, the same thing. His family lived in utter squalor. When the girl Cy goes to see the place, it's horrible. And there's a contrast between even how poorly the judge lives now on the downside compared to how this tutor, and that's the conflict, the political conflict. It's economic. Mm-hmm. More than anything else. The conflict between the rich and poor goes back as old as time.
There's a lot going on in this book. It's almost like, maybe part of your problem with it is it's hard to wrap it all up because there's so many complexities to all these different characters. Like the judge was he was the one member of his family that was going to make it, and they did everything they could to help him make it. But to make it, he had to go to school in England. And when he was in England, he was totally out of his element. So he could neither fit in there nor back at home. And he was powdering himself to make himself look more white so that he could fit in, because that was the whole appearance of moving on, was if you could be more white. So even in his retirement, he was still powdering himself, and that powder puff was
That's right, I recall
so
that.
important
And he
to
was
him.
laughed at by his family.
Right.
You know, and
For being obsessed with that.
Right.
Exactly.
I just don't think any of the characters are very likable. I mean, everybody had their foibles, if you want to call it that, and everybody had their problems, but nobody seemed to want to do anything about it. I mean, they were kind of wrapped up in themselves, trapped in their own worlds, and they couldn't see beyond, or even if they knew better, they just let themselves be sucked into this kind of pit of self-destruction almost, because everybody became self-destructive by the end, that they were just wallowing in all kinds of muck, if you want to talk about it. And that might be some of the contrast with the rainy season and everything else. I mean, it was just very depressing that people became alcoholic, or they would just not go outside and became depressed.
Yeah.
I found there was a couple times where backwards and forwards was mentioned in the book, and I think it's like as much as they tried to move forward and better themselves, they just kept getting drawn back to all of the old traditions and the things that they were used to, and that were, as horrible as they were, comfortable to them. So they could never quite get beyond that.
Right. And some of the neighbors around the judge, what Lolly, what were some of those characters with the teacups? They were holding on to their little British lives with their. And when those things got stolen, when the political uprisings and those things, their land was taken over, there's the contrast between that. But what I don't understand is what the writer was trying to tell us. Is it only depressing in India? I mean, it's only the most, nothing good ever happens? And that was...
Well, it's pretty focused on the one area.
But I think it also talked about how people had a structure in their lives, and when that structure didn't exist anymore, people didn't know what to do. I mean, when the political unrest came and poverty came, and even the people there were sisters who were living together in a very nice house who were from the former British Empire, when they met renegades who came through, they just didn't know what to do. They didn't know how to live anymore, which is what you're talking about.
Right.
They didn't have their teacups, and they didn't have their jam, they didn't have their scones, they just didn't know what to do.
And someone was invading their space.
Right.
That's
on their
interesting.
property.
I wonder how much of the author's experience in being educated in India and England, as well as the U.S., I mean, it sounds like she really used all of those parts of her life, brought them to bear on the characters' experiences. That's good. Well, actually, going back to an earlier point, how do you think that this book compares to other books that you've read by authors of Indian descent or set in India? Are there others that you like better, or are they, do you find a lot of similarities?
I think there's a lot of similarities in how the characters are drawn. There always seems to be somebody who becomes the rebellious youth who seems to revert back to whatever it is that they're all trying to move on beyond. Like in this story, it was the tutor, Guyan, I think that's how you'd say his name, where they're not really sure what it is that they want, but they want something to be passionate about, and so they go into some form of rebellion. And there was a character like that in White Teeth, which was similar theme, but taking place in England in Brick Lane.
Brick Lane, yeah. As far
Those
as
are two that I can think
more interesting books, I think Interpreter of Maladies was even though they're short stories, I found that much more interesting, and maybe I'm a Pollyanna, and I have to have some good news. And
when everybody's miserable.
Exactly.
Like it.
Brick Lane, you have a little bit of I was sitting here thinking, well, maybe that's it. Maybe I just need a little romance, or a little something happened where in A Fine Balance and in this Inheritance of Loss,
There was romance.
is romance, but not much happiness.
Right, not much happiness.
Very tragic romance.
Yes,
So
it was.
so maybe that's it.
And I
Although
think
sometimes
simple.
the simplest things would make them happy. They think their lives were so miserable, and then she'd describe it as and the clouds would break, and they'd see the peaks of the Himalayas in the distance, and that was enough to make their day wonderful.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
All right, well, I think we're getting close to the end here, so I want to wrap up with some discussion about whether you would recommend this book to book clubs and what that actually means. For example, if you had a good discussion, even if many of you didn't like it, would you recommend it? Or would you only recommend books that you had a general consensus, a positive consensus about? We'll start with you, Elaine.
I think it's important to read books that people don't like and other times people like. I don't think you need a consensus to have a good discussion. I mean, there was a lot in this book talking about cultures, talking about language that made for an interesting discussion.
Good, good. How about you, Trish? What do you think?
I agree with that. I would recommend it to book clubs because I think it was rich, and so it makes for a lot to talk about. Sometimes if we all would come together and having enjoyed a book, there just isn't any, well, we all liked it, so let's move on and talk about something else.
Move on to the refreshments, right? What do you think, Meredith?
I don't know if I would recommend this first. I would go with Brick Lane or Interpreter of Maladies first, but I do agree with Elaine and Trish that it is something to talk about. Obviously, we just talked about it.
Plenty to talk about.
And how about the element of learning about other parts of the world? I mean, is that something that is appealing to you when you're looking at a book? Or?
Yes, that's pretty key to us. Oh, we haven't read anything from this part of the world, so let's try it.
Interesting. And so, what's your next book?
Sidney Poitier's
Measure of a Man.
Measure of a Man. Okay.
So
and were you all enthusiastic about that choice, or?
Well, it was. I think it was led by somebody really wanting to go with something nonfiction, just as once in a while go into a nonfiction.
And the most important thing is nobody had read it yet.
Oh, right, exactly.
Right.
Oh, that's excellent. Well, you guys have been great guests, and I really appreciate you coming on. And we really had a diversity of opinion, and I think it was a good discussion. So, good luck to you with your next book. I hope it's good. I mean, I've heard wonderful things about it, and it's certainly selling well at the store. So.
Yes, he's 80 years old.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. He doesn't look it at all.
No, he's still a very handsome man.